You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hi, Michaela. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Me too. I think this is going to be a really important conversation for people in the yoga sphere because we're talking about an aspect of health that I think we don't often think about. It's kind of hidden, and that is bone health in the context of osteoporosis, which I know is something you work with quite a bit. So maybe we kick off for people by defining osteoporosis and osteopenia and how they are diagnosed.
Wonderful. Yes. I think that's very true that it's kind of this hidden thing. We don't really think about our bones as being a living tissue, but they are just like our muscle and anything else. So osteoporosis is a condition in which the bones become brittle and fragile due to a loss of the tissue. And this is due to an imbalance in the two cells that work in the bone tissue, and those are the osteoblasts, which build bone. I always think blast, be, build. And then osteoclasts, and those are which take bone away. Mm-hmm. And what happens is the osteoclast activity tends to get higher as we age. And then we have this imbalance, which causes an increased rate of bone resorption and leads to porous bones. With osteopenia, it's really just a decrease in bone density that is less severe than osteoporosis. And if you want to kind of look at that with numbers, you get diagnosed through a DEXA scan. And if you're looking at your score for DEXA, a -1 and higher would be a normal bone density, so that's good. A -1 to -2.5 would be that osteopenia area. And then a -2.5 and lower is when we start to diagnose it as osteoporosis.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we're not doing the diagnosing. This is something that's happening with radiologists and doctors, and it's something that somebody would come to you with a diagnosis of, as opposed to us being involved in that process. I love the way you talked there about bone being living tissue, and in all of us, whether we're 6 or 16 or 66, there is this constant process going on of bone building and bone breakdown. And it's just that the balance is tipping toward the extent that we're losing more bone density than we are building. So I love that you explained that right from the outset.
Yeah, that's a perfect way of putting it too, just that tipping of the balance. Yeah, and we typically see those DEXAs taking place around the age of 40, at least here in the US. I'm not sure if that's different across the world.
In New Zealand, it's 65 and over is when they start recommending DEXAs. So,
wow. But yeah, maybe they should think about earlier. But we see it suggested here around 40 years old, and then it's taken every 2 years.
Yeah, and I think there is a little bit of variability between different DEXA scans. So as far as the guidelines are here, they recommend that you go back to the same machine each time you get rescanned, so that what they're looking at is the change as opposed to the net result. What they're looking at is how this scan compares to your previous scan, looking for changes over time.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point.
So it's an interesting one in the sense that you don't often get symptoms in advance, or this is my understanding of, you can't look at somebody from the outside and determine whether they're likely to have a diagnosis of osteopenia or osteoporosis. It really does require that low density X-ray to actually look through their tissues and to look at the structure of the bones.
Yes, definitely. And I think like the only kind of clue you might have in some people would be that rounded forward posture, that kyphotic posture, which I know we'll touch on a lot later. But even that's not really a reliable sign. So it is just this very hidden thing. And I hear from a lot of the women in our program and just people that I talk to that they don't know that they have it until they fall and break something. And then that's what kind of spurs them to get the DEXA, to look into it more. So it is one of those things where you don't know until you know, which is
Yeah.
very unfortunate.
And you've already used some words that I think are really powerful. You used the words frail and brittle. And I think that can be such a confronting thing for people who, most of us go through our lives thinking about ourselves as being kind of strong and resilient and, capable. And to all of a sudden have this hidden secret thing sneak up on us and to make us feel like we can't even trust our own bones. I think there are some sort of mental and emotional aspects to osteoporosis that I'm sure we will talk about through the course of this conversation that, telling people that their bones are so brittle that they could even break from sneezing or bending over, that's a pretty hefty burden to be carrying around with you as you move through the very demands of daily life. So, yeah, something we will definitely talk about, I'm sure.
Definitely. And I think we'll probably cover this later on too, but when I'm working with people, I do try to be careful. I let them know the risks. I'm very clear about that, but I do try to be careful about not saying like, you could fall, you could break a bone from a sneeze. I try to create that balance where they are aware of the risks and they can act safely from there, but they're still feeling as if they can move through their life with some sense of confidence, even with that diagnosis.
100%. And, because everyone's level of bone mineral density is going to vary and the locations are going to vary, then obviously people are subject to different levels of risk. And that's not a conversation we need to have with them, but their medical providers can have with them. So in that diagnosis, we tend to hear about the spine, the pelvis, the neck of the femur or thigh bone, and the wrists as being the places that they look at most keenly to look for those bone mineral density losses. And I think we've already suggested this already, but there is a sort of classic profile for osteopenia and osteoporosis. The people most commonly affected tend to be women, don't they?
Yep. So that kind of profile you could paint would be a woman, usually in her older age. So typically post or perimenopausal, somewhere around 50s or up to, 60s and above. And that's because of the role of estrogen in bone health. So as we come into that peri and menopausal years, our estrogen stores start to diminish. And then estrogen really acts on the bones it acts on those osteoblasts, those building cells. And so when we start to diminish those stores, we lose some of that activity. And that's where we get that tipping point.
It definitely does affect some men too, and it does affect some younger people as well, especially linked with certain medical conditions or medications. But the classic profile is usually somebody who's female, has a lower body weight, and therefore have subjected their bones to less load. The more we load the bones, the more they tend to lay down tissue to meet that load. So yeah, the hormonal effects are kind of compounded with women tending to have lower body weight as well. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about what it is and who's most impacted. Why are we having this conversation today? Why is it so important to discuss in the context of the yoga population?
Well, in the context of the yoga population, I'd say there is that kind of hidden aspect of it where we can't see it. So we don't know who's coming into our class with it. And then on top of that, they might not even know. So in the yoga population, I think just being mindful of who your audience is. If you work with an older population, you might be mindful of certain cues. And we'll probably touch in on that more, but
for sure.
we see this a lot with like spinal flexion poses. So offering up some options so that people don't have to be in such a rounded forward position. And then just knowing that we can have really simple changes in our yoga instructions that can make a big difference for people feeling safe, for the overall effect of the practice, and just realizing that a significant number of people coming into your class probably are having osteopenia or osteoporosis.
Yeah, I think that's the clincher for me is given that most of us, everyone's experiences vary, but most of us are teaching a room of mainly women. And hopefully this is changing, but the classic population has been white and small bodied. So, when we think about the classic profile of somebody with osteopenia or osteoporosis, and we think about the classic Western yoga class, there's a pretty hefty overlap there. And you add in the hidden or the secret aspect that you spoke about, and it's something that I think all of us need to be a little bit better educated on. So let's shift gears from the sort of scary and depressing side to what we can do about it, the side that both of us are much more excited about. So maybe we start with the physical aspect. What kind of physical activities can we undergo, or, exercises can we do along with our conventional medical treatment? And maybe we should do a disclaimer there to say that obviously if you have been diagnosed with osteoporosis or osteopenia, you'll be working with a medical provider. There are definitely options in terms of hormone therapy and medication that they'll talk to you about, and they're important conversations to have. Outside of that, what else can we do?
So the big thing is loading. So
Mm-hmm.
loading our bones is going to be the most important thing we can do, and that's what we're really excited about, what I'm really excited about. And I love the way that you phrased it in your question, that loading is this avenue for strength and resilience as opposed to being something scary.
Oh,
So
yeah.
loading, yeah, and it's amazing. Loading, taking, if I may, just kind of sidestep away from bones for a second,
Mm-hmm.
but watching women load their body has so many positive effects outside of just bone health that really get me super excited. And that could be just like this empowerment that it brings, this ability to move through your daily life with a lot more ease. Like I think about picking up my dog food bag, and it's just easier when I've
Mm-hmm.
strength trained. And that confidence and independence that brings you. And then
You've
outside of
already
that,
hit on
there's,
something that I wanted to pull out, though, which is
yeah.
you've just been in a room with a doctor who told you that your bones are now brittle and porous,
Mm-hmm.
and the remedy is pick up some heavy stuff. And those two things don't instinctively go together. You'd kind of think like, man, if I'm now fragile, then I need to be careful. But actually the opposite is true to some extent. You need to be aware of the positions that you're in, but thinking of lifting loads instead of being this avenue of fear or potential damage to, can I retrain my bones to lay down more tissue? Yes, I can. To kind of flip
Yes.
that script in your own mind.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because I hear stories from women, and some people have these stories of like, my doctor told me not to lift more than 20 pounds. And to me, that's just like devastating because
Mm-hmm.
one, you're not going to be able to stimulate the bones to prevent further breakdown. And then also, how many options of your daily life just got taken away from you? Like your groceries might weigh 20 pounds, your grandkid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so knowing that there's another option and just looking into the research, it's very well researched. We can see that loading the bones does have a significant effect. And it's really more about the approach at which you do it. So, of course, we wouldn't jump you into lifting the loads that people work up to, which is going to be, we'll touch on this soon, but up to 70 to 80% of their body weight is what's shown to build bone density, and exercises like squat and deadlift. You wouldn't start there, but you can get there,
Mm-hmm.
and you can just do it slowly and progressively, and knowing that every step of the way you're doing something really good for your health and your bones there.
Mm-hmm. So the types of loading activities that we're talking about, you've mentioned already, getting to squatting, deadlifting. What kind of other, movement modalities or techniques do you employ?
Yes. So there's kind of these characteristics of exercises that elicit that bone building response.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you four here. The first one is strain magnitude. And so that is the force or impact of the training. So looking at something like gymnastics or weightlifting, that would be a strain magnitude type of movement. And then we have the strain rate, which is the rate of training. So that, or rate of impact of your training. And so that could be like plyometrics, jumping, so
Mm-hmm.
getting that impact into the bones. and then strain frequency, which is how often are you loading those bones in the time of your workout, and then rest intervals. And so that's introducing these rest intervals to resensitize the bone to the stimulus. And so what we see is activities like endurance running or cycling really aren't going to load the bones very much because they end up getting desensitized to the stimulus during those long training sessions. Whereas something like a interval session or a circuit where you're switching the exercises often is going to change the stimulus and therefore resensitize the bone so that it's laying down more bone in response to that stimulus. So what that really boils down to is the movements that are best for building bone are going to be strength training, high impact, and then interval, changing directions, mixing up your movements.
I love that. I love the way you laid that framework out. And you've also hinted at this already, which is, if you've just had this diagnosis from your doctor and you're feeling scared, you're not going to start swinging 80% of your body weight or, doing box jumps. There are progressive steps that you can take all the way along the way. Like even when you think about jumping and bouncing, I know you teach heel drops or heel taps where you lift up to tiptoes and then you just let your heels drop down onto the ground. So even that is presenting impact to the bones in the sort of same direction as gravity, which we call axial loading. So I love the way that there are progressive steps that you can take in all of those directions every step of the way.
We look at that axial loading, which is going to be that top-down loading. So we do that through exercises like overhead press, farmer's carries, which aren't overhead, but they are pulling the weight kind of downward with gravity there. And
like
then
you're
we
holding those
introduce the
heavy
use.
grocery bags.
Yes, exactly. So functional. And then we introduce the use of a weight vest as well, which provides this nice even loading all the way around the body of the vertebra, which has a big impact on our posture, which I'm sure we'll touch on shortly. And so those are the kind of axial loading exercises that we do. And then we use squat and deadlift to really target the hips, the femur, the pelvis. And we use the deadlift variation with a trap bar. If you're familiar with weightlifting, that's the one where your arms are out to your side rather than like a Romanian deadlifts, which is a hinging forward pattern, because that just keeps the chest a little bit more upright to reduce the risk of compression fractures.
I love that. So let's dive into compression fractures and that kyphotic posture and the importance of posture, because we've kind of hinted at it a couple of times, and I think that's worth really picking apart. So what are compression fractures? Why do they come up in the same conversation as osteoporosis?
Yes. So posture is a big piece of osteoporosis, and that's because we find compression fractures are when we get a fracture towards the front of the vertebra from loading the vertebra unevenly. And what's really interesting with the compression fractures is that there's actually kind of like two sides of the coin where sometimes our posture causes the fracture, and then sometimes the loss of bone density causes the posture. So going
you get
to the
that sort
former
of depressing cycle of self-feedback.
Yes. It's very tricky. So if you're someone who maybe worked at a desk your whole life and you've been very rounded forward, you have that kind of rounded posture that we're referencing here. We know that bone tends to grow where we're loading it. So what happens is that rounded forward posture, we load the front of the vertebra, which sounds like a good thing. But what happens is we get these like little like spiky bone growth. So it's not this kind of flat surface anymore. And then those spiky bone growths, once we maybe we fold over, we pick something heavy up, those are the part of the bone that's going to be susceptible to the fracture. So that's the one side of the coin where the posture caused the bone growth, and now that growth is susceptible to the fracture. The other side of the coin is if you lose density towards the front of the vertebra, which causes you to go into that rounded posture. And now you're in that rounded posture, you're loading that thinner section of the bone, and now that section of the bone can fracture. So it's a really interesting, like, two sides of the coin there.
And in terms of the person that you're dealing with in front of you right now, it almost doesn't matter which pathway got them there. If they've got that excessively rounded posture, I know I can think of from my own yoga practice a bunch of things that I can do about that. Let's talk about some of the things that you do to help kind of retrain posture and give them a bunch more options than just that rounded forward, that hunched forward option.
Yes. So the big one that I really like to emphasize is strengthening the posterior chain. So it's strengthening the back of the body there. And I think that is just such an effective tool. It not only gives you that opportunity to load, but it also is going to help to strengthen the muscles so that they're coming out of that lengthened posture, that lengthened position, and then we naturally find that kind of chest opening effect. I do find a lot of value in stretching the muscles at the front of the chest, but it does have to be paired with that strengthening at the back of the shoulder as well.
So I'm thinking about all kinds of active back bends, like locust
Mhm.
pose, for example, lifting your arms against gravity, lifting your head and your shoulder blades against gravity, squeezing your shoulder blades back and down, and just re-educating the whole back of the body to wake up and switch on and do some work.
Yes, I love like any type of prone work, any type of
Mhm.
prone shoulder, even just taking the arms out to a T and squeezing the
Yes.
shoulder blades together. You do that like 10 or 15 times, you'll definitely feel it.
Mhm.
Um, so anything prone is really wonderful. From a weight perspective, if you could add in some um, rows, band pull aparts,
Mhm.
anything to get the back of the body firing up. But then we think about posture kind of taking it out of just that thoracic spine region and just looking at the whole back of the body. The glutes are important for posture. So strengthening the glutes, the hamstrings, even the feet have a really
Mhm.
huge effect on that whole chain. So it's all integrated and working together.
I love that. And I know you also do quite a bit of work on head and neck alignment, because that's
Mm.
like, it's not even the cherry on top. It's like a really heavy cherry on top that can
It's
pull
like
the
the
whole chain
big,
forward.
yeah, it's like the big bowling ball on top.
Which
Yes,
kind
we
of
do a
ruins
lot of
my ice
chin
cream sundae
tucks.
analogy, but it's much more accurate, isn't it?
Yes. We do a lot of that chin tuck exercise where you think about pulling that chin back. Um, I sometimes use a cue like someone has like your ponytail, they're gently pulling it up and back. Um, of course, I would never actually pull someone's ponytail. I would just let them visualize it. But
Safety disclaimer, don't pull anyone's ponytail. But yeah,
yes.
you're looking at the entire structure, not just shoulder blades and rib cage, thoracic spine, but also what's happening below. Strong glutes, strong hamstrings, a sturdy foundation through the feet, and also
Mhm.
looking at the influence of weight on top. Where is the head? Where is the neck? Can you kind of re-educate people as to their perception of neutral, so that it's not with the chin drifting forward and that bowling ball putting strain on the whole back chain? I love that.
Yes. And a really easy cue is just thinking about earlobes over shoulders, shoulders over hips, hips over knees over feet. And
Mhm.
even just as a teacher, just like having that visual walking around the class, you can kind of use that as a really quick visual check-in to see what's going on. And if you need to cue little changes, or even as a student, that helps me when I check in with myself. I often need to make little adjustments there.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's definitely a conversation around posture all the time about, demonizing rounded posture as being unhelpful, and having rigid military posture as being equally unhelpful. And I do agree with all of that nuanced conversation. But I think it's important to know what your starting tendency is. And if your default is a really rounded upper back and your head drifting forward and your chin jutting forward, then obviously you want to remind your body that you have lots of other options that aren't that, and to kind of re-educate the entire structure. And I think osteoporosis or not, it's really helpful to know what your default is and cultivate other options. When it comes to osteoporosis, probably even more important. Yeah, I'm glad we had that
Yes,
postural
definitely.
discussion. What about
Yeah.
balance? Because when we think about these bones being, frail and brittle and all the depressing phrases that you see when you look up WebMD, you said a lot of people don't even know that they have osteoporosis until they fall and they break something in a situation where they wouldn't have expected to. So again, when it comes to yoga practice, I think about balance and coordination being a huge part of what we do. What are some of the ways that you work on people's balance and coordination?
Yes. So, safety first, always, especially with osteoporosis, is if you're going to be working on someone's balance, just do so next to a wall or with a chair nearby, a chair on a surface that's not going to slide out from them, away from
Yes.
them. So, on a sticky mat or against a wall. So, just making sure that you have those precautions in place. But looking at balance, we've got those three systems that work together in the body to create our sense of balance. That's that proprioception, our body awareness. We've got our visual system and our vestibular system. So that vestibular is the inner ear. And so there's lots of ways you can play with that, but really what it boils down to is changing your orientation to gravity, engaging and touching different surfaces with your feet so that you are kind of taking away or amplifying that proprioceptive feedback, and maybe moving your head around too. So that kind of goes with the inner ear, and the eyes often kind of pair together with head movements, eye movements, shifting your orientation around, and
Mm.
really just working on playing with those variables so that people can start to recalibrate more quickly when they're kind of taken off their center of balance.
I love the way that you express that. People can recalibrate more quickly when they're taken off their center of balance, because that's exactly what we're trying to future proof people for. I think sometimes we think
Hmm.
about yoga as being, I've got great balance because I can stand in tree pose for a minute. That's great. It's nice to have that skill, but that's not really going to translate into fall prevention. So, kind of tweaking our appreciation of balance in a yoga perspective to our capacity to regain our center of gravity after it's been perturbed in various ways, like changing our footing, moving our gaze, moving our head and our inner ear, and just gradually training people to have a more responsive and receptive system. I love that. I think that's exactly what people need, so that if they do trip on the edge of the rug or slip on a bit of ice or, a
Hmm.
wet floor, they're used to regaining their center of gravity quickly rather than falling over.
Yes. And I think in a yoga perspective, taking balance and just expanding what you think of as a balance practice. So it's not so much about standing in tree pose for a minute,
Mhm.
but maybe going from warrior three to standing with your knee drawn into your chest, back to warrior two and back to warrior three, and just kind of flowing in between these postures in a way where you have to, your head is naturally moving, your
Mhm.
gaze is naturally moving. And then you're building also the other piece of balance is that foot and ankle and leg and hip stability that's going to be able to, hold you through all of those different perturbations as you shift through different postures.
Yeah, I could not be nodding any more vigorously here. You were speaking my language. And I mean, this is something that I'm really passionate about in the way that I teach in yoga medicine online
Hmm.
and in person. Don't wait until you're 60 and you get a diagnosis of osteoporosis to be working on your balance. It's much, much easier to work on it in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, you can make
Hmm.
changes at any age, but why not start with a head start? Why not give yourself an easy entry by working on your balance in these uh, much more active and real world ways right from the beginning of your yoga practice? Yes. Two thumbs up from me. So I think we've covered quite a bit of the physical aspect of what we can do if we have a diagnosis of osteoporosis. You talked about loading, lifting heavy things, progressively training that capacity over time. You also talked about axial loading when we're not lifting with our arms, but we are carrying weight through our skeleton, like the weight vest or the farmer carry. You talked about exposing ourselves to impact, maybe just heel drops, maybe bouncing, maybe jumping. And then you talked about changes to posture and activating that whole posterior chain, the whole back of the body, to actively draw the shoulder blades back and down and lift our chest and open us up. Anything else that you want to talk about? Oh, and balance and stability, of course, where we just finished off. Anything else that you feel like we've missed in the physical aspect that we need to talk about?
Um, Let me see. I think the only thing would just be the specifics of loading. So I kind of touched on it briefly, but the research really says like 70 to 80% of your body weight lifting for those squat and deadlifts, at least 2 times a week, 2 to 3 is kind of what's in the literature.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't do that, whether it's access to a coach who would safely get you there, or you don't have a gym membership near you available, whatever the case may be, if you are able to get some dumbbells at home and you can lift lighter loads, but more days a week, you'll still be building up to a significant volume throughout that course of the week, which is really what we're just trying to get to. It's just a pretty high volume of load going into those bones. So
Mm-hmm.
just to kind of ground that for people to know that, if they can't get to that 70 or 80%, like hope's not lost.
Yeah, there's always something you can do. And that kind of leads me into a somewhat controversial question that in the circles I move on in social media, I see very hotly debated. Can yoga alone retain or build bone mineral density? What are your thoughts on that topic?
This is a complicated one.
No, I want yes or no, and that's all we're going to use as a soundbite.
Black or white only.
Yeah,
Um, Sorry, it depends.
yeah, of course.
I would say, the more untrained you are, so the more that you haven't done yoga or haven't been very physically active, the more that you're going to respond to lighter loads. So yoga can be such a good jumping off point.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairly safe and contained practice to begin moving your body if that's new to you. It builds a lot of body awareness, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
really important, especially if you're going to go and start to add load to your body. Um, and then, I mean, Lauren Fishman's studies, we have those. I know those are a hotly debated topic as well.
Yeah.
And I think, the big critiques that I hear of that is that it was more of a survey than a study. The sample size was fairly small. And I think that all of that is very valid.
Yeah,
But
agreed.
I think, I like to look at things from both perspectives and to be fairly optimistic. There was significant bone growth or bone density improvements in that study. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's worth just totally like brushing under the rug.
Yeah.
So I think that yoga can be a wonderful starting point, a great supplement to building bone. And I think it really just depends on the individual coming in. If
Mm-hmm.
you've been practicing yoga for a long time and you have osteoporosis, you're likely not stimulating those bones the way you need to kind of work your way towards having, a lower DEXA scan number or a
Yeah,
higher DEXA scan number.
a better one.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I
those negative
completely
numbers get
agree.
tricky.
I completely agree with everything that you've said there. That the two big resources that we tend to see referred to in this conversation are Dr. Lauren Fishman's initial pilot study and then survey, a relatively small number of people doing, gosh, how many was it? Like 12 poses every
Mhm.
day, 30 seconds each for 10 years. And some people did see noticeable, clinically significant changes in their bone mineral density. So that's something. And I agree, if this is not something you're adapted to previously, then why not start there? Like you said, it's relatively safe, great way to build body awareness and consciousness of your posture, which becomes really important when you start to lift heavy things. The other big resource that we see referred to is the Lift More study. Do you want to say anything about that?
So the Livermore study is one that I'm not as familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
but I did do a little digging into that a week or so ago, actually. And from my understanding, they are also they're also adding weightlifting into the
Yes,
program as well, right?
absolutely. And it's that 70 to 80% of body weight is what they're building up to, exactly as is in your program.
Yes. So, I would say that's a little trickier because they've got the loading as well. So it's hard to kind of isolate the yoga from the loading.
Yeah, and I think that's where the conversation tends to come to at the end. Like if you are somebody who's new to working out or new to challenging your body in a physical sense, and you haven't been practicing yoga already, then it sounds like a great starting point. And there's definitely potential for you to challenge your muscles enough for your muscles to pull on your bones and encourage your bones to lay down bone mineral density at a slightly higher rate. If you've already been doing that, then you're probably going to need to, as you said, add some additional load, some new stimulus that your bones and muscles are not adapted to. And that's where the Lift More study, I think, provides a really helpful pathway for those of us who are already practicing yoga and are already adapted to that load. So this one is high intensity resistance and impact training, improves bone mineral density and physical function in postmenopausal women with osteopenia and osteoporosis. The Lift More randomized control trial, very catchy, but I will link to it in the show notes for those of you who are interested and want to dive into the details. And basically, it sounds very similar to the program that you and Dr. Sarah Avery have developed with your added component of yoga. So we've covered the physical side, and I think yoga can definitely play some roles there, especially in posture, balance, coordination, body awareness. But we touched on the mental and emotional side earlier, and that to me is where yoga really is uniquely suited to be a companion piece to the, you got to lift some heavy things and you've got to do some axial loading on your skeleton. So what are your thoughts on yoga's role in that mental and emotional side?
Yoga it's kind of that flip side of the coin again, where it's that more kind of slower compassion, more internal focus practice. And I think that, so many people get this diagnosis of osteoporosis, and it can be really devastating for them, but it's also like they have to keep going on with their life. So there's not always enough time to really pause and process that. And I think that yoga can be a really welcoming space to do that. You get this time to be with your breath, your body. The energy of a yoga class is typically much more grounded, especially if you're kind of painting the picture of someone with osteoporosis. They're probably not going to like a hot vinyasa class. They're probably going to a more grounded, slow flow type of class. And so I think that it gives this inward space to like process some of those emotions. And then I also think that there's something really special about yoga communities. There's like a reason why people get so hooked into yoga is because the community space there is so welcoming and inviting and supportive. And whether or not you're talking to people about your osteoporosis at your yoga class, just building community, I think, can really help you to feel less alone. And then eventually, maybe that leads you into talking about, I've got this diagnosis and it really has me down. But just community alone is one of the biggest things that we hear from the participants in our program, is just the community that they built and how much that means to them. And I think that a yoga practice or a yoga space is just such a wonderful way to build that community. And then another kind of interesting thing is that stress has an impact on bones. So chronically elevated stress affects your HPA axis. That can alter the way that your bones are absorbing and laying down tissue.
Yeah,
And
nothing in the body happens in isolation. We're swimming in a sea of neurotransmitters and hormones that change everything. It's true, but we forget, don't we?
And so yoga can be such a great stress management tool as well, which may have, even if it's a small percentage of impact on that bone health, it's worth taking every percentage you can get. So just using yoga as that stress management tool may have a positive effect on those bones as well.
Yeah, and we know it does on lots of other systems in the body. So it's like, why not? Or why not employ some more tools for stress management? Yeah, I think you've picked out some really important things there. The fear factor of hearing words like frail and brittle, and I just did the quickest Google search, and the first thing that came up was bones can even break when you sneeze. Carrying that weight around with you, I think there is something very isolating about that kind of feeling of fear and mistrust in your own body. And the antidote to that is, as you so beautifully put it, coming together with other people, connecting with other people. I think it's much harder for fear to live in a supportive community environment than it is when you're all by yourself. And you're right, why not capitalize on opportunities to learn some extra techniques to reduce your stress levels and to help you live in a little more equanimity? I love that. When it comes to teaching yoga, assuming that if you're teaching a room full of people that are, 50 plus, you might have 1 in 5 of your participants having a diagnosis of osteoporosis, whether they know it or not. Do you have any sort of do's and don'ts that you would suggest?
So I think that kind of depends on the teacher style and how they want to handle their interaction with osteoporosis.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to kind of call it out, you can give cues. Like if you know you have this diagnosis, you can do X instead of Y.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give those examples in a second there. But the other option is just to give those options, and you don't need to call out the osteoporosis if that feels awkward or clumsy or uncomfortable, or like you would be putting someone on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
And so do's and don'ts, we want to be really mindful about flexion. So we already touched on that related to compression fractures. So any pose where we're kind of rounded forward and hanging there heavy. So we can think of like a ragdoll pose or a seated forward fold where we're letting the spine round. We might just want to give the option to people to stay more in an upright position. So instead of ragdoll, you could say if ragdoll doesn't work for you, you can place your hands on blocks to lift you to more of a halfway position.
Mm-hmm.
You can lift your chest and reach forward and notice how that changes things. If rounding your spine doesn't feel good for you, or for any reason you don't want to round your spine. And then always, as I touched on with balance, just give people options for balance. You might say like, we'll be moving through these balancing poses. If you feel more comfortable next to a wall, please feel free to just scoot your mat there. Or you could even give the disclaimer at the beginning of class, we'll be practicing some balance. If you feel more comfortable, park yourself next to a wall so you can have it
Mm-hmm.
there for support. And even just, I think of really simple things that have changed in the way that I teach, going from more of like a younger version of myself teaching a lot of vinyasa practice to more of an older version of myself working with older adults, is even just something like stepping back from a lunge. Instead of just like assuming everyone can float their foot back, you can say you can tiptoe your toes back, or you can,
Mm-hmm.
skim over the ground and float your foot back, so that people know that just giving people like this bigger permission to adapt the
Mm-hmm.
practice is really the point I'm trying to make. And then as far as those compression fractures, like I said, we want to avoid any excessive spinal flexion there. And then we also want to work around any excessive range of motion and twists or lateral bends as well. So we're just being mindful of the spine and the potential of those density differences in different places of the vertebra.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to think about more active twists, or cueing in such a way where it's, twist to the point of resistance and then stop there and breathe. Don't push yourself into the resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of being mindful of those positions there.
Yeah, and I think there are benefits to that approach for a huge range of people, whether they have osteoporosis or not, to kind of notice how much of your range of motion you can create with your muscles, and how does it feel when you pause there and breathe into it, as opposed to automatically going as far as you can possibly go. And and,
Mhm.
and I, like you, teach with a lot of options, just depending on the day. Maybe today you leave the tiptoes on the floor. Maybe today you stay here and you don't step back. Maybe you tiptoe your foot back or skim the foot across the floor. So just reminding people that every day is different, and they are allowed to modify their practice to respond to what they're showing up with on the day, I think is just kind of covers a whole range of options, doesn't it? Covers you for a whole heap of conditions, osteoporosis, neurological, just mood and energy, blood sugar levels,
Yes.
everything. Yeah. Just the best way
Yeah,
to
and
approach teaching.
yeah, I would say just like as a blanket rule, it's a pretty good one to go by. Um, One question I get asked a lot, so I think it's important to note here, is just cat cow. A lot of people ask, like, is cat safe? In my opinion, yes, but again, it comes down to cueing. So rather than saying, like, really push into the floor around your back, you could say, like, this is more about spinal mobility and
Mm-hmm.
just moving between the different shapes, exploring that sensation. And you can say, like, gently broaden your upper back. So just kind of cat cow is one that always gets questions because
Yeah.
we do
And
use it
child's pose, people ask about
often.
that a lot. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I agree. It's not up to us as teachers, especially in a group setting, to know exactly what's going to be safe for each individual. So I think if questions are coming up from your students and you're unsure, refer them to their doctor or their physical therapist. One thing that we didn't mention in the diagnosis phase is your diagnosis of osteopenia or osteoporosis is based on your lowest number out of all of the locations that they survey. So you could be teaching somebody
Hmm.
who's been diagnosed with osteoporosis. It's just in the neck of their femur or thigh bone, and their spine's actually fine. You don't know, and it's not your job to know, fortunately. So if you're getting really detailed questions, you can definitely refer people back to their medical providers as to specifically which positions they need to be wary of and which they can proceed as normal.
Yeah, and it's okay to say I don't know to people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to respect you a lot more if you just say, like, I'm not sure about that. That's something you
Mm-hmm.
need to ask your doctor versus like trying to make something up or, you know, and like you might end up putting your foot in your mouth. So just being honest, letting people know. And if it's getting into these really detailed questions, you know, saying that's out of my scope of practice is
Mm-hmm.
perfectly fine. Yeah.
Agreed, 100%. The other question that came up for me in the yoga context was something that a lot of yoga medicine teachers use, which is myofascial release. What are your
Mm.
thoughts on any particular approaches that you might take in a population that you know is likely to have osteoporosis when it comes to myofascial release?
Well, I love myofascial release. I think that especially older adults, like it feels so good. So I think that you can still use it. You just have some precautions you want to take.
Mm-hmm.
The main ones are just going to be where you're placing the balls. So just being very careful about not placing those balls directly onto bony prominences, specifically of the vertebra.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so when I work with someone who has osteoporosis, we use wool dryer balls instead
Oh,
of the
nice.
silicone balls, and which takes a lot of fear away from, my mental space of as she's using them. But um it's such an effective tool that I don't want to take it away. So the
Mm-hmm.
wool dryer balls really kind of lighten up that hesitancy to place them um, in certain places. So if you're working with someone and you're in person, you could even place the balls yourself so that you're extra sure, like that they're not going to be landing on any of those bony prominences.
Mm-hmm.
And then making sure that you're just leveraging some of the body weight off of the balls there so that they're not pushing so firmly into the body. So I really love the wall as a tool for that. Um, almost all almost all of the myofascial practices can be adjusted to come to the wall, or maybe even in a seat. You could do your feet on a seat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so just being mindful of how much weight you're leveraging over those balls there, their placement. If you are able to kind of place them yourself, so you can be a little extra careful, and then watching out again, just using softer tools if you have them.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think those are really practical solutions that we can use easily without completely
Hmm.
changing our approach. Careful with placement, less body weight, less intensity. And I think a lot of the research around myofascial release is leaning in that direction anyway. Less is more, a
Hmm.
lighter touch. So they're not really missing out on the benefits as far as we know from research at the moment. I think that's great. And I think you've covered the real gamut of specific physical things and also the much more subtle. Even when you were talking about myofascial release there, you talked about some things that you would do in terms of placement, but the student feeling safe as well as you being
Hmm.
confident they are safe, them also feeling like this is good for me, this is safe for me. I think is such an important part of the conversation. The kind of the techniques that we use are important. The approach that we take, I think, is just as important. So what big takeaways would you like to leave people with? What kind of messages would you like them to walk away from this conversation remembering?
I hope that they walk away just feeling much more empowered if they have a diagnosis of osteopenia or osteoporosis. I hope that they're walking away feeling like there are options for them to do something, especially if you're someone who doesn't want to take medication or just concerned about medication for any reason, knowing that there are some options that you have that are very effective outside of that. Knowing that there's really simple techniques you can do just to modify your yoga practice, your myofascial release practice, your balance practice, and that the body is adaptable, it's resilient, and that you can create change. It takes a nice, progressive, steady approach. And if you can kind of frame that progressive approach as just being like this exciting journey you get to take, and watch how much stronger you get and watch how much like more confidence you can build in yourself, it can be a really, really fun, empowering thing.
100%. And from my own experience of working with this population, I've had people go to the extent of saying, I'm glad that I had that compression fracture in my back. I'm stronger now. I'm more connected to my body now. I would never have learned these lessons without that really terrifying setback. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, that feeling of confidence and capacity and resilience, kind of reframing the fear around loading and turning it into a challenge that you can relish over time. There's no rush. You have the entire rest of your life to do this work. I love that. Where would you send people who want to know more about you, more about your program, more about what you do?
Yes. So we have my business partner and friend, Dr. Sarah Avery. We have a program together that we run in person. So if you happen to live in Saratoga Springs, New York, we would love for you to join us. And you can find more information about that on both of our websites, but the sign up is through Sarah's website. I'll provide you the link, but it's
Great.
In Motion Integrative PT. That's her Instagram handle. My Instagram handle is Michaela Moves Well. That's also my website. And then we've just launched a virtual version of the program with Kari, and that one you can find out all the information on all of our websites. But again, the sign up for that program will be through Kari's website. And again, I can provide you that link for the description there.
We'll put all of those links in the show notes, along with the Lift More trial for those of you who are interested in looking into that study. And I also have a class series on yoga medicine online that is specifically for people who are new to yoga and come with a diagnosis of osteoporosis and want to find a kind of safe starting point, a safe launching point, just to kind of teach you some fundamentals about things to be aware of, issues to be aware of in your alignment, so that you can then feel a little bit more confident exploring a wider range of practices. So we'll link to all of those. Michaela, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experience and your excitement and your enthusiasm on this topic.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our yoga medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.